previous segment, we discussed the role that inclusive deliberation might play in making good decisions. A different strand of the epistemic argument for democracy focuses not on talking, but on counting. Arguments in this vein also focus on the idea that everybody might have something to contribute, but rely on several formal arguments that appear to demonstrate that there can be an epistemic advantage to using a larger number of people to make some decision, having to do with the positive epistemic properties of judgment aggregation with large numbers of judgers. So that's a mouthful. We'll get into the details in a moment. So one well-known argument here relies on what's called the Condorcet jury theorem, developed by Marquis de Condorcet, born in 1743, died 1794. He was a French philosopher, mathematician, and an early political scientist. Unusual for his day, he advocated for free and equal public education and equal rights for women and people of all races. But he's best known for developing a number of formal tools that highlight the epistemic value of voting by large electorates. So the Condorcet jury theorem itself suggests that among large electorates voting on some yes or no question, the majority is virtually certain of getting the correct answer as long as three conditions hold. So the first condition, independence, that all the members of the group vote independently of each other. The second condition, what's called enlightenment, that the voters are better than random at choosing the correct answer. And the third condition, sincerity, that the voters vote sincerely as opposed to strategically. So they vote based on what they think the right answer is to the yes or no question. If all of those conditions hold, then increasing the size of the group increases the probability of the majority getting it right. As the number increases, the probability moves exceedingly close to 100%, almost certain that they'll get the right answer. If these conditions hold for a particular political community, with respect to a particular question that could be framed as a yes or no question, then the Condorcet jury theorem would provide a very powerful argument in favor of using democratic means of having everyone vote and letting the majority choice win. There's been a great deal of recent discussion of the Condorcet jury theorem. So the main focus, the main concern has been about the enlightenment condition, the idea that the voters have to be better than random at choosing the correct answer to the yes-no question. So formal work has been done. It's been shown that actually what's needed is that the median voter, the person in the middle, if we lined everyone up from worst to best, the median voter, the person in the middle, has to be better than random. So that means they would be better than a 50-50 chance if we flipped a coin at getting the answer right. So let's take some examples. So maybe the question is, are there more than 5 countries in Africa? So we might suppose the median voter will be better than random at this, having a greater than 50% chance of getting the answer right. But if we change the question to, are there exactly 53 countries in Africa? That number might drop considerably in terms of the accuracy of the median voter. Turns out to be a bit tricky to know what the right answer is to this question, just toy example, but either 55 or 56 countries looks plausible. Different ways of figuring out which countries count as countries end up giving different answers. So another worry related to this, so there's the difficulty in the competence of the voters. A related worry is the possibility of what's called systematic error. So if we've all been indoctrinated to believe something that's false, we'll all be, or there's a chance that we'll all be below 50% chance of getting the question right. So you might think it's not going to be random or randomly distributed if we've all been indoctrinated in some way to believe something false. Important result with the Condorcet jury theorem is just as it very quickly approaches certainty that we'll get the answer right if we're above 50% competence, if we're below 50% competence, it very quickly approaches certainty that as the group gets larger, that we'll get the answer wrong. So that's a real worry and a place where a lot of attention has been focused, sort of thinking about this enlightenment assumption, this enlightenment condition. And it's worth thinking about the extent to which political questions look anything like factual yes or no questions, and what it would mean to get the correct answer to some political question. So we'll talk about that more in later sections. We'll also consider this general issue more in the section on freedom and autonomy. So a big issue for epistemic arguments and arguments about happiness or the general welfare in general is that there can be significant disagreement within a political community about what even counts as promoting happiness or promoting the general welfare. Another way of thinking about this is there can be disagreement about what would count as getting the right answer to some of these political questions. It won't be as simple as the yes or no question, are there more than 5 countries in Africa? So if we disagree about these things, if we disagree about what the right answer is, then we might disagree on, in particular, whether this Enlightenment condition is satisfied. It might be hard to test it. Moving to a similar idea that people have talked about, so away from the Condorcet jury theorem to something called the miracle of aggregation, or other people write about as the wisdom of the crowd. So Francis Galton, born in 1822, died in 1911, was an English anthropologist, explorer, inventor, scientist, and statistician, among many other things. He has this really interesting, sort of well-known anecdote that illustrates the phenomenon of the miracle of aggregation. So in 1906, he was visiting a livestock fair, and he stumbled upon a contest. An ox was on display, and the villagers were being invited to guess the animal's weight. So nearly 800 people participated, but no one hit the exact mark. The exact answer was 1,198 pounds. That was how much the ox weighed. So Galton himself suggested that the middlemost estimate expresses the voice of the people, every other estimate being condemned as too low or too high by a majority of the voters. So he was sort of thinking about the median again. And so he calculated this median value to be 1,207 pounds. So if you lined up all the guesses, that was the one right in the middle. So to his surprise, this was within 0.8% of the weight measured by the judges, extremely close to getting the answer right. It turns out that the average guess, so not the middle, but if you added them all up and then divided by the total number, was 1,197 pounds, which was even more accurate, almost perfectly getting it right. So this is a striking phenomenon. What could possibly explain this average being so close, closer than any of the individual votes, individual guesses? So James Surowiecki has written a book, The Wisdom of Crowds, that discusses this phenomenon in great detail and discusses many other examples. So one main question in this work is about why this happens. Why does the average guess of large numbers of people on matters with a factual answer tend to be uncannily accurate? So one suggestion is that as long as uninformed people's answers are randomly or symmetrically distributed, they will cancel each other out. This will lead to a bunch of noise from the uninformed, with the views of a truly well-informed subset of the whole all congregating around the correct answer. So you might have some views out here that are quite wrong, and some views out here that are quite wrong, but they'll cancel each other out in a nice way, and leaving the views in the middle, maybe those of the truly well-informed, to actually drive the result. So the aggregation of many views still allows the cream, as it were, to rise to the top. The most accurate views will be the ones that come out. And this is better in many ways than having to identify the experts, the people who truly are well-informed, since it may not always be apparent who counts as an expert. A second possibility that might explain this isn't this idea of error canceling out, but the possibility that all of the people have opinions that are roughly correct, and the distribution of errors around each individual's somewhat fuzzy judgment makes it so that individual errors cancel each other out in the aggregate. We might each have a pretty good ability to guess the number of pebbles in a jar, for example, and so we'll make guesses near the correct answer, and the ways in which we're off will cancel out, or somehow in the whole we'll get to be very close to the average. So there's questions about when this happens or why this happens in detail, and there's issues about why would we see this kind of canceling out, and that's something that Surowiecki and others have talked a lot about. But the thought is that as long as uninformed people's answers are randomly or symmetrically distributed, or as long as all of us are roughly correct, the incorrect answers will fall by the wayside, leaving the correct result as the average. So Surowiecki and other thinkers have highlighted the value of markets in terms of harnessing lots of disparately held information. So they argue for using what are called prediction markets, where people are allowed to bet, for example, on who will be, say, the Republican nominee for president in 2016, and people place various wagers and a market develops. In earlier work, Friedrich Hayek, a 20th century Austrian economist and philosopher, developed some related ideas in advocating for using markets and against what are called collectivist or centrally planned political and economic systems. So in his classic work, The Use of Knowledge in Society, he wrote, "Today it is almost heresy to suggest that scientific knowledge is not the sum of all knowledge, but a little reflection will show that there is beyond question a body of very important and unorganized knowledge, which cannot possibly be called scientific in the sense of knowledge of general rules, and that is, the knowledge of the particular circumstances of time and place. It is with respect to this that practically every individual has some advantage over all others, because he possesses unique information of which beneficial use might be made, but of which use can be made only if the decisions depending on it are left to him or are made with his active cooperation. We need to remember only how much we have to learn in any occupation after we have completed our theoretical training, how big a part of our working life we spend learning particular jobs, and how valuable an asset in all walks of life is knowledge of people, of local conditions, and of special circumstances. To know of and put to use a machine not fully employed, or somebody's skill which could be better utilized, or to be aware of a surplus stock which can be drawn upon during an interruption of supplies, is socially quite as useful as the knowledge of better alternative techniques." So Hayek uses this idea of locally held knowledge that's widely distributed, that isn't organized by general rules or principles, or at least not obviously so. He uses this idea to defend the use of market economies and fair market prices to price goods and services, rather than having central planners try to correctly identify the value or worth of goods and set prices from some central political office. He also used this thought to motivate something like democratic input to political systems, since in that case, again, we're dealing with lots of detailed and dispersed information about what people want and what they value and what they think would be best. So this connects us back too to Mill's thought that we discussed earlier, that each of us is a better judge of our own interests than any other person is. So there's a liberty, freedom, autonomy dimension to that, but there's also an informational dimension to that. So in thinking about cognitive diversity, the Condorcet jury theorem, the wisdom of crowds, and the informational value of markets, we've seen a number of different kinds of reasons to think that the many will have better views than the few, even than a few experts, particularly if we have broadly inclusive rules regarding who gets to have a say, who gets to participate. So this may all provide a reason to have something like a democratic state with robust norms of inclusion and aggregation of views, where everyone gets to participate and have a say, and where there's robust norms of free speech and free press and free association, all to help us get the right or best answer to our political problems. Of course, this depends on whether we see any of these theories applying in practice and whether we actually get these results. And particularly it depends on whether there are features of the informational environment in the actual world that lead to systematic bias and error. So perhaps everyone gets their news or their information from the same biased source, or there are strict limits on which views can be expressed. Under those circumstances, a lot of these arguments won't work. It also depends on political questions being ones that have a substantial factual component, so that these methods and talk of getting the right answer make sense. But if these things are in place, then there may be a significant role for the state in harnessing our collective intelligence so as to make decisions that truly promote happiness and the general welfare.